The winter of 1830 lay heavy on Taos like a wool blanket soaked in river ice. The sun rose late and without warmth, its pale disk doing little more than turn the frosted adobe walls of the plaza into slabs of dull gold. Smoke coiled from horno ovens where women baked coarse bread, mule trains clattered in from the Santa Fe Trail, their iron bells sounding thin and tired in the cold air. Taos Pueblo traders with their bright-woven mantas moved through the morning bustle beside Mexican soldados in stiff blue coats, French engagés bargaining in cracked mixtures of languages, and Ute and Jicarilla families selling hand-tanned hides. In winter, the plaza felt closer to the wider world, compressed, concentrated, loud yet still ringed by mountains that seemed to watch every human motion like old gods dispassionately waiting out the centuries. Through the noise and barter and smoke walked Elias Boone Hardesty, a tall, raw-boned mountain man, not yet 30, yet carved by the land, as though he'd lived twice that long. His face was lean, wind-burned, the kind that made men think of cliff edges and far horizons. A puckered scar ran along his left forearm, crow arrowhead, long-heeled, and his dark hair, tied back with a strip of rawhide, brushed the collar of a fur-lined coat that had seen the Yellowstone, the Missouri headwaters, and 2 hard winters in the Wind River country. He moved with that particular economy common to men who'd lived months at a time without seeing another soul. Nothing wasted, nothing hurried, everything deliberate. What set him apart was not the rifle on his shoulder or the powder horn at his side. It was the map carefully folded, protected within an otter-skin pouch, bound with a thong of treated buckskin. Not many in Taos knew he had it, and those who did assumed it was another of those scraps of frontier fancy trappers carried for luck. Half legend, half lie, wholly useless. But Elias carried it with the same quiet reverence a priest might give a sacred relic. The map was unlike anything else from the fur country. It was made not of paper, fragile, brief, but of buckskin fused to parchment, a hybrid piece of frontier craftsmanship. Spanish shorthand symbols danced along its edges, the cramped kind favored by 17th-century expeditions. The Vargas Entradas, the priests who recorded the pueblos, the soldiers who trudged north in search of gold they never found. Interwoven among these were Ute directional glyphs, laid down in paint and charcoal that had faded but not vanished. At its center were mission marks leading east, toward the Pecos, the Sangre de Cristos, and the high ridges where Spanish friars once whispered of riches that had swallowed men whole. Elias had received it from a dying Ute elder the previous spring, a man half remembered by the tribe, half feared, known among trappers only as Old Dog in the Snow. The elder had spoken in uneven breaths, telling Elias that the map led to Las Minas Perdidas, the lost mines, sought by Coronado, then by Vargas, then by wandering friars who vanished into canyons never to return. Some said the mines were cursed. Some said they were illusions, mirages drawn on hearts hungry for more than the frontier could give. In Taos, such stories earned you nothing but a laugh. That afternoon, as Elias stepped into O'Rourke's tavern, the air inside hit him like a blow. The smell of wet wool, spilled whiskey, wood smoke, and too many men waiting for spring. French trappers played cards near the hearth. Kelso, the Irish muleteer, told a new lie about a beaver that supposedly dragged him into the Green River. And a pair of Mexican soldiers dozed near the bar, hats tilted low, boots stretched out. Hardly had Elias taken a seat before the talk began. "Heard you're still carrying that ghost map, Hardesty," called Laframboise, one of the engagés with a beard so red it looked almost unnatural. "Friar tales," another laughed. "Spaniards drew more lies on hide than any man could count. Next thing he'll tell us is Coronado himself carved instructions on a buffalo rib, or that the Ute painted him a trail straight into Ute hell." Elias gave no reply. Taos taverns were full of voices, and not all warranted answering. He sipped coffee thick as tar and watched the fire burn low, feeling the map's weight inside his coat. The mockery didn't bother him. Jedediah Smith had traveled with a Bible and a compass and little else, mapping half a continent with faith and bone-deep stubbornness. Men had mocked Smith, too, right up to the day he walked alone from California back to the Rockies. The frontier didn't belong to the loudest men, it belonged to the ones who kept walking. Still, word of a Spanish mine was dangerous. Too many had killed for less. Larpenteur once wrote that a man on the frontier owned only what he could defend with his rifle or his silence. Elias chose silence. By late afternoon, the wind kicked up, hurling grit across the plaza. Traders pulled blankets around their shoulders and hurried to their lodges. Soldiers cursed their orders to stand watch. Ravens flapped low, heading toward the cottonwoods by the Rio Pueblo. Elias left the tavern and cut through the square, boots crunching over frost. He passed stalls selling pinole, knives, trinkets, dried venison, and small carvings from the Pueblo. A child running past nearly collided with him, and the woman chasing him offered Elias a tired nod. The world in Taos felt both ancient and temporary, the kind of place where a man might stumble on a story 5 centuries old while buying tobacco, or hear an Indian tale that outlasted every dynasty Spain ever crowned. Night came early. Elias returned to the small room he rented behind a saddler's shop. Cold crept through the adobe walls. He lit a lantern, its glow pushing back only a few feet of the darkness. Outside, a mule brayed, and the wind rattled. Something loose on the roof. He sat at the narrow table, its surface scarred with years of careless knife strokes, and drew the map from its otterskin pouch. Spread flat, the hide felt alive, somehow stretched and shaped by men long dead, marked by hands that had vanished into the dust of forgotten trails. He traced the Spanish shorthand, crosses, loops, tiny circles marking way stations. He traced the Ute glyphs, the river serpent, the ridge teeth, the sun bear for south, the night crow for north. Then he saw it. A symbol he'd overlooked every time before, a small compass rose, painted in faded rust red. But it was wrong, utterly wrong. No Spaniard would draw a compass like that. Their symbols leaned precise and mathematical, taught by priests, measured by quadrants and astrolabes. This compass rose was simpler, tilted slightly left, the sort mountain men etched into rifle stocks or carved onto trees to mark a trail. The kind that used Polaris, not a quadrant. The kind that told a man how to walk by night. Elias leaned back slowly, heart steady but eyes brightening. Maybe the mockers were wrong. Maybe this map wasn't meant for Spaniards. Maybe it was meant for a man like him. The cold still held Taos in its fist the next dawn. But Elias Boone Hardesty woke before the sun, long habits stronger than winter's bite. Breath fogged in the dim room. He rolled and stretched quietly, like a wolf testing its legs before rising from snow. The lantern had burned low in the night, leaving only a faint coal at its wick. But the map spread open on the table, where he'd fallen asleep, studying it waited in the half-light like a patient teacher. The tilted compass rose, still pulled at his thoughts. No Spaniard, even a half-trained one, would mark north the way this one did. The shape wasn't European at all. It was frontier-born, rough and certain, a guide for men who traveled by stars instead of instruments. Elias remembered the Crow elders who taught him how to read the sky the way white men read letters. He remembered a winter stretched along the Yellowstone when the nights were so long the stars felt as loud as firecrackers in the cold. A compass rose drawn this way meant one thing. The directions only aligned under starlight. Most men on the frontier feared the desert at night. But some men, like Jedediah Smith and a handful of crow hunters, knew that darkness wasn't the enemy. The sky was a map older than any drawn by Spanish hand. Elias packed slowly and carefully, the way Larpenteur described in his journals. Powder first, wrapped in oilcloth, balls and patches next, coffee and parfleche strips of dried meat, flint and steel, a spare thong for snowshoe lashing, tallow candles, one Spanish trade blanket, everything in its place, everything meant to last. He paused over the map, then folded it with gentle fingers, as though the thing itself could bruise. Outside, Taos stirred. Muleteers cursed the cold. Pueblo women carried baskets of dried corn. 2 soldados marched stiffly past, boots thudding against frost-hardened dirt. Over at the blacksmith's, someone hammered a stubborn shoe back into shape. Winter made every sound sharp. "Heading out, Hardesty?" came a voice from behind. Elias turned to see Tom Laramie. an American free trapper whose reputation was as mixed as the buckskins. He wore half good, half trouble. Laramie's nose had been broken too many times to sit straight, and he carried a hawk-and rifle that he treated with the same affection he denied his fellow men. "Maybe," Elias replied. Laramie nodded toward the otter-skin pouch. "Still chasing that friar gold?" The words were thrown lightly, but the eyes behind them measured Elias carefully. "It ain't gold," Elias said. "Not sure what it is, but the map's real." Laramie spat into the snow. "Carson once told me the Spaniards lied more'n they prayed. If they found gold out there, the whole territory would have heard the shouting." "Maybe," Elias said again. He didn't bother explaining the compass rose. Some things only made sense to the man who discovered them. Laramie shrugged. "You take care. Desert'll cook you by day and freeze you by night. Seen men die both ways." Elias nodded and walked on. Conversation carried no more weight in his mind. The map had chosen its time. Past the plaza, he saddled his horse, a claybank gelding with a Crow name meaning "step soft on snow." The animal flicked its ears, sensing a long trail ahead. Elias cinched the saddle twice, slung his possibles bag across his body, and tied the map pouch tight. When he mounted, the gelding pawed once at the frozen earth, impatient. The sky had not yet brightened when he reached the edge of Taos. The mountains stood dark and monumental, blocking half the heavens. Behind him the town huddled like a creature asleep with one eye open. Ahead lay the desert, the old Spanish trail, and whatever waited in the folds of forgotten history. He traveled until noon, then rested in the shadow of a red-banked arroyo. He studied the map again. The Spanish symbols aligned poorly with true north unless a man accounted for magnetic declination, that subtle drift between where a compass pointed and where the world actually lay. Surveyors cursed it, priests ignored it. But mountain men learned to compensate by using a trick taught by Crow starwalkers: a rawhide thong, a ramrod, and Polaris. At night, Elias would drive his ramrod into the ground, tie a thong to its tip, and stretch it toward the North Star. The length of the shadow and its angle against the ramrod would mark true north, no matter what a compass dial might claim. He had used the trick in the Wind River country, and once crossing the high basins of the Yellowstone. It had never failed him. Now it explained the map. The compass rose wasn't tilted wrongly. It was tilted honestly, made for a man who traveled under stars, not sun. Which meant entire map was drawn to night bearings, not day. Elias felt a slow heat rise in his chest, not excitement, but certainty warming him from within. He would have to travel by night. By dusk he was moving again, riding toward the first line of mesas, marking the trail toward the Jornada del Muerto. Coyotes howled in the distance. Mule deer bounded across moonlit flats. The air was so cold it cracked when he breathed. Then, as the last of the daylight bled away, Elias stopped, planted his ramrod in the sand, tied the rawhide thong, and lifted it slowly toward Polaris, the old star that had watched every man on every trail since time began. The thong aligned perfectly with the tilted rose on the map. Elias Boone Hardesty smiled into the desert night, the first smile he'd shown in days. The old man wasn't lying, he murmured. The lost mines might still be myth. But the map? The map was beginning to speak. The first night on the Jornada del Muerto felt like stepping into a world stripped of mercy. Even under moonlight, the desert looked endless, a pale, bone-dry ocean, broken only by mesas that rose like stranded ships. Elias Boone Hardesty rode slowly, letting his horse pick its path across the cracked clay. In daylight, the Jornada could kill a man before noon. At night, it merely waited, patient, silent, watching. Elias preferred the watching. The cold sharpened everything. Each hoofstep echoed like a hammer tap. Each breath came out white and ragged. Above, the stars spilled across the sky in a bright sprawl so dense it looked like frost on black iron. The Crow believed the Milky Way was the path of spirits, where the dead walked toward the next lodge. Out here, Elias could almost believe it. The night sky felt close enough to touch. He checked the map again. In lantern glow, the old Ute symbols looked alive, the painted lines breathing under the buckskin's grain. Spanish shorthand curled in loops and angles. Water here. Ridge crossing. Narrow trail. Old mine sign. Some symbols were familiar from Jesuit-style maps, others were entirely strange. The glyphs for directions drawn in Ute pictorial style ran like a shadow trail across the hide, but the compass rose held everything together. Nothing matched daytime bearings. He halted at a ridge and planted his ramrod again. Rawhide thong straightened toward Polaris. The bearing matched the map perfectly. "Night map," he whispered, "made for men who feared the day." Why would Spaniards travel by night? Elias didn't need to think long. Apache raiders hunted the daylight. Noise carried miles in the thin desert air. Heat stole water faster than a wound stole blood. A night map wasn't strange, it was genius. Around midnight, the wind rose from the south, carrying sand that whispered across the desert like a distant voice. The Jornada del Muerto had swallowed entire caravans. Bones lay under dunes where no man would ever find them again. Smith wrote of deserts like this, places where the land gives no counsel. But Elias had counsel. The map, the compass, the stars. He pressed on. Hours later, a faint silhouette jutted from the landscape, a low ridge splitting the desert like a scar. The map marked it with a small symbol, a cross with 3 slashes beneath it. Elias remembered seeing something similar in an old Spanish codex in Santa Fe Tres Marcas, a marker used to indicate dangerous descent or old workings. He dismounted and approached on foot. The moon cast everything in blue-white shadow, making edges seem both sharp and uncertain. The ridge sloped downward into a shallow basin. Elias's boot nudged something half-buried. He crouched and brushed away sand. A rusted iron spike, hand-forged, 17th century. Spanish. His breath caught, and for a moment he heard only the desert wind. "So the old man spoke true," he muttered. A few feet further lay the remnants of a wooden frame collapsed into splinters, but unmistakably the remains of a Spanish prospect pit. The timbers were blackened with age and sand-worn smooth. He found a shard of crucible glass blue-black fused with bits of ore. He turned it in his hand. The color looked right for silver-bearing galena. Not proof, but close. He followed the ridge downward, careful with each step. The map showed a Ute glyph, a zigzag line meaning earth breaks. Sure enough, the ground beneath his feet felt unstable. A shallow depression cut into the basin floor, nearly invisible until you stood right over it. He knelt and lowered his lantern. Light fell onto a hole the size of a wagon wheel, a collapsed vertical shaft. Without thinking, he whispered a crow prayer for the dead. Smith wrote of places where Spaniards dug and died, their names forgotten. Schultz recorded tales from tribes who watched Europeans vanish into holes carved into sacred ground. Elias had never believed those stories entirely. Now he did. He moved away from the shaft. Desert silence pressed in again. Even his horse seemed uneasy, pawing at the ground as if sensing spirits lingering in the basin. Elias mounted up and rode north, following the bearing shown on the night map. Hours passed. The desert changed subtly, sand giving way to scraggly scrub, scrub giving way to low, eroded mesas. The moon sank lower. Dawn crept at the horizon, pink and cold. He stopped before sunrise to avoid the killing heat. A shallow cave in a sandstone bluff offered shelter. Inside, the air smelled old, mineral-laced. He let the horse rest and tucked himself into a corner, map in hand. Then the wind rose again, this time fierce, a sudden fury that roared across the desert like an angry spirit. Sand ripped past the cave mouth in great streaming sheets. Elias shielded the lantern with his coat. Outside, the Jornada screamed. He'd been in storms like this before. Men told tales of sand so strong it peeled skin. Elias waited it out, jaw set. When the wind finally died, the world outside had changed. His tracks, the horse's tracks, even the ridge he came down all erased. A lesser man would have panicked. The Jornada del Muerto was famous for swallowing trails. But Elias stepped outside, planted his ramrod, tied the thong, and lifted it toward Polaris. "Still got you," he murmured to the map. The desert could erase footprints, but it couldn't erase the sky. He traveled until the next nightfall, reaching the base of a mesa. One glance told him the stories were right. Spaniards had been here. Cut steps marked the stone face, small, shallow, made by men desperate to climb quickly with tools on their backs. He climbed slowly, lantern dangling from his belt. At the top, the moon revealed it clearly. A Spanish cross, carved into the mesa wall, weathered nearly smooth by centuries. Exactly where the map said it would be. Elias Boone Hardesty pressed his hand to the cold stone. "Taos boys can call it ghost gold all they like," he whispered, "but something happened here." Behind him, the desert stretched silent and endless. Ahead, the lost mines, real or not, waited. The mesa top held a stillness so complete that Elias Boone Hardesty felt as if he'd stepped into a world suspended between centuries. The desert far below shimmered faintly beneath the moon, a pale sea rolling outward to every horizon. Nothing moved, not the wind, not the stars, not even the silence. It was the kind of stillness men wrote about in journals, but could never fully describe the stillness of a place that had watched whole civilizations pass beneath its stone face. Elias ran his fingers over the Spanish cross carved into the mesa wall. The edges were weathered soft, but the hand that chiseled it had been steady. Spaniards didn't mark rocks for fun. Every symbol meant something: danger, direction, or divine protection. And this one? This was a waymark, a sign for men following behind. He stepped back and lifted the lantern. The rock face glowed faintly. Beneath the cross, almost invisible under the grain of time, were 3 faint gouges, slashes that matched the same Tres Marcas symbol on the map. That sealed it. No friar tale, no ghost story. This was a road men had walked before him, men who never returned. He moved along the mesa's rim, scanning for more signs. The ground was uneven, covered in shale and dust. After several yards, something glinted under the lantern's cast. He crouched and brushed fingers across a cold shape. A Ventura-style chisel, its blade broken clean through. He lifted it, weighing it in his palm. The chisel was old, 17th century, maybe early 18th. The steel had thinned with rust, but the craftsmanship was unmistakably Spanish. Men once used tools like this to test ore seams. Elias had seen one similar in a Santa Fe museum. Nearby lay a small spur rowel, rusted but intact. Spanish cavalry spurs were distinctive, large, often decorative, meant to jingle as the rider approached. This one was simple, utilitarian, the kind used by soldiers who traveled deep into hostile lands with more fear than ceremony. Elias felt the hair on his arms stand. The desert was starting to talk. He followed shallow grooves cut into the stone boot-worn channels that led down the far side of the mesa. The descent was treacherous, steps hacked into sandstone by men in a hurry, probably starved for water, desperate to find shade or salvation. He descended slowly, testing each foothold. At the base, the terrain narrowed into a choke canyon, barely wide enough for a mule. The walls rose sheer and cold. Lantern light flickered across soot, marks black streaks running vertically. Torches. Spaniards had come this way carrying torches, just as the map said. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. The canyon absorbed sound. Even his boots seemed afraid to echo. Halfway through, he spotted the Ute sign painted on a bulging rock. A coiled line with 3 swirls. Serpent water. A hidden spring. He followed the direction indicated by a second glyph, a jagged arrow-like shape representing turn of earth. 20 paces later he found water trickling from a crack in the wall. Not much, but enough to drink and fill his canteen. The Spaniards would have needed this water desperately. He knelt, splashing his face. The water tasted faintly of minerals, clean enough for a hard-traveled man. When he rose, he was no longer alone. A lone Navajo stood at the canyon mouth, tall and wrapped in a blanket patterned with crimson and black diamonds. His face was unreadable in the lantern glow, though his eyes reflected light like an animal's. "You follow dead men's shadows," the Navajo said quietly. Elias didn't reach for his rifle. The man's presence felt too deliberate for threat. He would have killed Elias already if he wanted to. "I follow their trail," Elias answered. "I ain't looking for trouble." "No one looks for trouble," the Navajo said, "but men find it when they dig in the old places." He stepped closer. His voice held neither anger nor fear, only a tired certainty. "My grandfather told of Spaniards who came here. They scratched at the mountains, took bright stones, and left bones in the sand. The earth swallowed them because they did not listen." Elias nodded slowly. "Maybe so. But their marks brought me here?" The Navajo gave a faint, almost pitying smile. "The mountain remembers men like you. It remembers those who return and those who don't." He motioned toward the canyon's continuation. "Beyond this place is a narrow world, a world of shadows. Go if you must, but you walk where ghosts breathe." Elias offered the man dried meat from his parfleche. The Navajo accepted it respectfully, nodded once, and walked into the desert night without another word, vanishing as silently as he'd arrived. Elias waited until the echoes of his steps faded, then pushed on. The canyon funneled him into a slot passage, narrow enough he had to turn sideways. The walls rose twice his height, smooth as if sandstorms had polished them for centuries. His lantern's flame bent with the airflow. Then he saw it black soot streaks leading into a wider opening. He stepped inside. The chamber beyond was artificial. Spaniards had built it, no question. The ceiling bore the marks of chisels. The floor, smoothed by countless boots, sloped downward into another corridor. Elias swept the lantern around. Shadows fled, revealing a sealed cache. Stones stacked deliberately into a crude wall. He dropped to one knee and touched the stones. Old mortar crumbled beneath his fingers. He pushed gently. The top stone loosened. A moment later, the entire wall collapsed inward with a dusty sigh. Inside lay a rusted pickhead, a broken crucifix stained with azogue mercury, a small bag of ore samples, a Spanish dagger with a shattered hilt. He lifted the ore bag. The rocks inside gleamed faintly in lantern light, heavy, metallic. Veins of silver-gray thread ran through the stone. He exhaled long and slow. This was no legend. No tavern tale, no ghost gold fantasy. The Spaniards had been here. They had found something, and they had died trying to take it. Elias stared deeper into the dark corridor that led further underground. "The map ain't lying," he whispered. But whatever lay ahead, it hadn't forgiven those who came before. The opening beyond the collapsed cache yawned like a throat, swallowing lantern light before it could touch the far walls. Elias Boone Hardesty stood at its edge, one hand resting on the rough stone, the other gripping the lantern as if weighing its courage against the darkness ahead. No wind reached this place. No sound but the faint settling of dust. The Spaniards who carved this passage were centuries gone, but their fear lingered like a scent. He knelt again, lifting the ore bag to eye, level. Silver-gray veins threaded through the black matrix, galena rich with promise. Men had bled for rock like this. Some still would. He tied the pouch shut and tucked it into his possibles bag. Whatever lay deeper underground, the ore alone proved the old Ute elder had not lied. But proof came with a price. He raised the lantern and stepped inside. The corridor sloped downward, carved by tools but shaped by time. The walls bore the scars of chisels, some strokes deep and sure, others frantic, uneven, as if made by men working in haste or terror. Elias moved slowly. His boots stirred dust that whispered like falling ash. The air smelled old, dry, stale, faintly metallic. He felt it in his throat like the taste of forgotten years. He passed torch sconces worked crudely into the stone. Many had collapsed, others still held the charred remains of Spanish torches. He broke one off, weighing the blackened stick. "Men died holding these," he murmured, then dropped it. At the first bend, the ceiling lowered. He ducked instinctively. His lantern revealed a narrow crevice off to the left, and in it, half buried in dust, he found a rosary. The beads cracked, the crucifix snapped. Azogue mercury stained the metal dark. He'd seen the same staining on artifacts in Santa Fe. Miners used mercury to separate silver from ore. The Spaniards hadn't come here to pray. They'd come here to dig. He moved forward. The passage grew tighter, beginning to twist. The walls on either side bore Ute pictographs, painted in ochre so old they looked like faded memories. One symbol caught his breath, a crooked mouth, lined with teeth, swallowing a stick figure. Elias touched the mark lightly. "Earth-swallowing place," he translated. The Ute had warned them. A few steps later, the corridor opened abruptly into a larger chamber, the ceiling rising high enough for the lantern's glow to vanish upward. Shadows danced along distant stone ribs. In the center of the room stood the remains of Spanish supports, timbers once strong, now skeletal with rot. One beam had split down the middle, collapsing into a heap that looked disturbingly like a grave mound. Elias approached, lantern lifted. A boot lay half buried in sand, inside it bone. He bowed his head briefly. Whatever the Spaniards had sought, they'd found death first. A faint rumble echoed somewhere deep in the labyrinth, so distant Elias couldn't tell if it came from shifting rock or his own blood pounding in his ears. The desert above him was silent. Down here, the world breathed. He skirted the rotted supports, stepping carefully between piles of debris. At the far end of the chamber, another passage slanted downward. He hesitated, lantern swaying in a slow arc. Part of him wanted to turn back, take the ore sample, and be content with what he'd already found. But the map, its compass rose, its strange hybrid symbols pulled him onward, and the dying Ute elder's words echoed in his memory, like a drumbeat. "Follow the night road, follow until the earth shows its teeth." Elias checked the walls again. The Ute glyphs continued guides for men who respected the land, not those who tried to conquer it. He descended. The second passage narrowed into a low tunnel, forcing him to crouch. His lantern scraped the ceiling. Dust fell in soft flurries. The tunnel twisted left, then right, then dipped sharply like a snake diving into sand. He paused only when the tunnel leveled again and widened. Ahead, a soft breeze brushed his cheek cold, carrying hints of minerals and something else. Airflow from a deeper chamber. He followed it. The tunnel opened into a cavern vast enough to swallow a church. The lantern's reach barely touched the nearest formations, stalactites hanging like frozen fangs, stalagmites rising like silent guards. The Spaniards had carved a narrow walkway along the left wall, reinforced by timbers that were now bowed with centuries of pressure. Elias tested one with his hand. It groaned. "This whole place could come down," he muttered. A glint caught his eye. He turned the lantern. On a ledge halfway across the cavern lay an abandoned leather satchel, half rotted but still holding shape. He stretched across the walkway, reached, and dragged it toward him. The flap tore open, releasing dust and a small scatter of objects. A rusted hammerstone, a tiny bronze crucifix, a strip of parchment covered in Spanish shorthand, and 3 chunks of ore heavier than the ones in the cache. He lifted one. It gleamed like dull moonlight. Silver. Rich silver. The lost mines weren't myth. They were real. And he was standing inside them. But the cavern didn't celebrate. It moaned just once, a deep groan that rolled through the stone like thunder trapped underground. Elias looked up. The ceiling shifted. "Time to leave," he said quietly. He stuffed one ore chunk into his bag for proof, dropped the rest, they were too heavy, cursed, and back toward the tunnel. Another deep groan. Dust rained down. A timber cracked like a gunshot. Elias ducked, sprinting through the narrow passage as the cavern behind him began to collapse. Rocks crashed. Air whooshed past his ears. He scraped elbows, shoulders, knees, scrambling forward as the earth swallowed its secrets. When he burst back into the Ute-marked chamber, he was coughing, covered in dust, adrenaline bright in his veins. The collapse echoed behind him, then faded into silence. He leaned against the wall, heart hammering. "All right," he whispered harshly. Message heard. The mine didn't want company, but he had what he came for. A sample, a story carved into stone, proof the trappers mocked, the Spaniards died for, and the desert tried to bury forever. Now he only had to get out, and the desert wide, watching and patient, waited above. The night Elias Boone Hardesty clawed his way out of the canyon mouth, he felt the cold more sharply than usual, not the honest cold of mountain winters, but the thin, metallic kind that haunted the desert after something beneath the earth had shifted. Dust still clung to his hair and beard. His coat was torn at the elbow. The ore sample weighed heavily in his possibles bag like a beating heart. Behind him, the mountain had sealed its secrets with a final groan, as if exhaling the last breath of the men who died inside it. He stood on the open sand, breathing the free air, and for a moment believed the worst was behind him. Then he saw the tracks, fresh, 3 horses, headed the same direction he needed to travel. He crouched, touching the prints with 2 fingers. The sand still held warmth under the thin crust of night frost. "They're close," he murmured. Word in Taos traveled faster than a prairie fire in a dry wind. Someone had seen him leave. Someone had followed. And now someone knew he was chasing a story no man had managed to kill fully. Not Spaniards, not Apaches, not the desert itself. He swung into the saddle, jaw tight. His horse, step soft on snow, snorted, sensing the tension. Together they rode into the wind, guided only by moonlight and the night map that had brought him this far. The Jornada del Muerto stretched ahead, a pale emptiness that swallowed sound. Out here, any rider stood out like a silhouette against the sky. The 3 men ahead had a lead, but Elias had the advantage of moving at night, while most men clung blindly to daylight. He rode north, following the faintest bearing, planting his ramrod whenever he stopped to confirm alignment with Polaris. The compass trick saved him again. Every few miles, he checked the sky, adjusted direction, and pressed on. By the second hour, he'd gained on them. He heard the first distant whinny carried on the wind. Not coyotes, not mustangs, horses under saddle. He crested a low rise and saw them at last, 3 silhouettes moving in a staggered line. He recognized the posture of the lead rider, even from a distance, Tom Laramie, the man from Taos who'd asked too many questions. Behind him, 2 others, one Mexican with a bright sirop draped over his shoulders, the other a Kentucky trapper known for switching sides whenever coin got involved. They slowed, turned, scanning the horizon. They knew he was behind them. Elias slipped off the ridge before they spotted him. The desert floor was a broken patch of lava rock black, uneven, dangerous to cross at night. The Jornada was full of such traps, ancient basalt flows that cracked under a horse's weight. Spaniards wrote of men dying from broken legs in fields like this. But Elias trusted step soft on snow, and the horse trusted him. They entered the lava field like ghosts. Hooves clicked softly on basalt. Shadows turned to sharper shadows. The moon vanished behind a cloud, leaving only faint sky glow to navigate. Elias slowed his breathing to match the horse's rhythm. Behind him, he heard a distant curse. Someone in the trio had followed into the basalt. "A fool's choice," he whispered. He dismounted and led his horse on foot, feet feeling for solid rock. Ahead, the field narrowed, funneled between 2 jagged ridges. He slipped through, then circled around a basalt spire. From this vantage, he could see the faint glow of a lantern bobbing too far left. The Mexican prospector rode into a shadowed cleft. A moment later, the sound of collapsing stone, followed by a scream cut short. Elias closed his eyes briefly. The desert had taken its due. 2 riders remained. He mounted again and pressed north. His night compass trick set the pace. Check, adjust, ride. When the stars drifted behind clouds, he waited for them. When moonlight struck the sands clean, he galloped. The desert rewarded patience, not pride. By dawn, he reached the low hills east of the Pecos. Sagebrush clung to shallow slopes. The cold bit deeper here. He rode into a dry wash and dismounted, letting his horse drink from a small puddle left over from a past storm. Footsteps crunched behind him. He turned, hand dropping to his knife. Tom Laramie and the Kentucky trapper approached, rifles slung lazy-like across their arms. Their horses steamed in the early light. Laramie grinned. "You been busy, Hardesty." Elias said nothing. The Kentucky man raised his chin. "Map's real, ain't it? Folks in Taos didn't think so, but you knew. You always know. What I know, Elias said slowly, is that place kills men. Laramie shrugged. Men die for less than silver. Hand over the map. Elias didn't move. Laramie lowered his rifle. Don't make this hard. You don't understand, Elias said. That mine collapsed, closed itself up. It ain't given up anything. The Kentucky trapper barked a laugh. Then you won't mind handin' over what you found. Elias reached into his coat slowly, too slowly for Laramie's liking. A click echoed across the wash as Laramie cocked his rifle. Elias froze, lifted his other hand. Then he spoke, voice calm but razor-edged. I ain't givin' you anything, and I ain't drawing on you unless you force me. The Kentucky trapper started forward. Laramie hesitated. That hesitation saved Elias. He dropped low, rolled behind a boulder as the Kentucky trapper fired. Rock chips burst near his face. Elias pulled his knife, crow-taut grip tight, and lunged as the Kentucky man swung his rifle to club him. Steel flashed. A grunt. A stumble. The trapper collapsed, clutching his gut. Laramie leveled his rifle, but he didn't shoot. His eyes met Elias's. For a heartbeat, something like respect flickered there, or fear. You got the desert in you, Laramie said. Elias didn't answer. Laramie backed away, mounted, and rode off without another word. The wash fell silent again. Elias sheathed his knife with steady hands, though his chest still throbbed with the rush of survival. He checked his horse, tightened his saddle, and mounted. The sun climbed. The horizon opened. Taos lay northward, days away. He pressed on, leaving behind the mine, the dead, and the desert's relentless hunger. But he carried something with him no one could steal. The road back to Taos stretched long and stark beneath Elias Boone Hardesty's horse, a thin ribbon of dust crossing a land that felt older than memory. The Pecos rose slowly in the distance, blue with morning haze, their foothills scattered with juniper and the sharp scent of winter sage. Elias rode quietly, his body aching from the fight in the wash, his coat stiff with dried dust from the mine's collapse. Steps soft on snow moved with steady confidence, as though sensing his rider's urgency but also his weariness. By the second day, the last traces of the Jornada del Muerto fell behind him. The plains widened. Creeks wound between cottonwoods stripped bare by the season, and the sky turned the pale color of a washed-out map fitting. Considering the otter-skin pouch beneath Elias's coat held the last unburned secret of a Spanish dream that had become a mountain man's burden, he reached Taos at dusk. Smoke coiled from the Pueblo chimneys like welcome signals. The plaza bustled even in winter. Traders shouted prices. Soldados paced the adobe walls, and French engagés argued loudly over who owed who for lost traps. The familiar mix of voices wrapped around Elias like an old blanket, rough, dirty, and far more comforting than he would admit. He walked his horse through the crowd, nodding to faces he knew, but saying little. Word of his return traveled quickly. Men stepped aside. A few whispered, one or two stared openly at the dried blood on his sleeve. But no one approached. Not yet. He dismounted outside the forge of Don Mateo Rivera, the Mexican blacksmith who'd been in Taos longer than most men could remember. A wiry old fellow with arms like braided rope and eyes sharp enough to read a man's soul through smoke. If anyone could tell him what the ore truly was, it was Don Mateo. The blacksmith looked up from the anvil, eyebrows rising. Hardesty, thought the desert swallowed you. Almost did, Elias said. Need your eyes on something. He untied the ore sample and set it on the anvil. Don Mateo wiped his hands, picked up the chunk, and turned it beneath the lantern's glow. He tapped it twice with a hammer, listened to the ring, then scraped it with a file. His eyes narrowed. Where did you get this? South, Elias said. Far south, Rivera snorted. You bring me a stone from hell itself, and you expect me to believe that answer? Elias didn't reply. He didn't need to. The old man set the ore down carefully, reverently. This is silver-bearing galena, rich, very rich. The Spaniards mined rock like this in Chihuahua, and in a few places north, but this, He tapped it. "This is old. The mercury stain tells me so. This rock was touched by Spaniards long before your parents were born." Elias felt relief wash through him, not triumph, but validation. Proof he wasn't chasing ghost stories. Proof the map wasn't trickery or madness. But validation carried danger. Don Mateo looked at him steadily. "You found one of their workings, didn't you?" "Found what was left of it," Elias said. "And it tried to bury me with the rest of them." The blacksmith nodded slowly, as if confirming a suspicion carved in the back of his mind for decades. "Spanish mines are cursed," he said, "or guarded, or simply foolish." His gaze softened. "You bring this to me. Why? Because you're the only man here who won't talk about it first chance he gets." The blacksmith grunted. "You give me too much credit." But he wrapped the ore in cloth and handed it back. "Keep this close. And keep your mouth shut." Elias nodded. He already planned to. That night he returned to his small room behind the saddler's shop. He lit a single lantern and set the map on the table. Its hybrid lines, Spanish shorthand, Ute glyphs, and that slanted compass rose seemed almost alive in the flickering glow. He stared at it a long time. The desert had proven the map was real. The mines existed. The ore in his pouch was undeniable evidence. But the map also carried something else: responsibility. Men died because they chased things drawn in ink and imagined in greed. He touched the edge of the hide, then he reached for the lantern. The flames caught slowly, then hungrily. Buckskin curled and blackened. Spanish symbols vanished into smoke. Ute glyphs burned last, stubborn as truth. Elias watched until nothing remained but ash on the table and a faint smell of charred history. He kept only one thing: his journal, and the memory of the desert night when the compass trick aligned the stars with a forgotten path. When he stepped outside, the cold bit deep. The wind whispered through the plaza. Taos slept lightly, like a town waiting for the next story to arrive. Elias Boone Hardesty pulled his coat tight and walked into the darkness, whispering, "Some maps ain't drawn on hide, some are carved into the men who survive 'em."